There are moments throughout human history where the sky has done something that nobody could explain. Moments where not just one person, but hundreds, sometimes thousands of people, all looked up at the same time and saw something that defied everything they thought they knew about the world. Tonight, we are going to walk through some of the most chilling and well-documented mass UFO sightings ever recorded, events witnessed by so many people that dismissing them becomes almost impossible. Long before the age of radar, fighter jets, or smartphone cameras, something appeared in the sky over one of Europe's most prominent cities that would leave an impression so profound it was immortalized in print within weeks of the event. It was the morning of April 14th, 1561, in the city of Nuremberg, Germany. At the time, Nuremberg was a thriving city within the Holy Roman Empire, a place of culture and commerce where artisans, merchants, and clergy walked cobblestone streets beneath the spires of grand churches. It was a city that had seen its share of hardship, battered by the consequences of religious upheaval following the Reformation, and its citizens were deeply superstitious, clinging to the belief that celestial events carried messages from God. On that particular spring morning, just as the sun began to rise between 4 and 5 o'clock, the people of Nuremberg stepped outside into what should have been an ordinary dawn. Instead, they saw something that would haunt the city's collective memory for centuries. According to a broadsheet published later that month by Hans Glaser, a local printer and woodcut artist, the citizens of Nuremberg witnessed what appeared to be an enormous aerial battle playing out against the face of the rising sun. Glaser's account, which was illustrated with a now famous woodcut and accompanied by his own detailed description, paints a scene that feels ripped from a science fiction film written nearly 500 years too early. In the broadsheet, Glaser describes how two large, blood-red, crescent-shaped arcs appeared in the center of the sun, resembling the moon in its last quarter phase. Surrounding these crescents, globes of various sizes emerged, some blood-red, some bluish, some black. These globes were mixed with what Glaser described as cylindrical tubes, or rod-like shapes, and cross-shaped formations. The objects seemed to swarm across the sky with purpose, moving erratically, some appearing to fight one another. As the account describes, the globes in the sun flew outward toward the others, and then the ones on the sides flew into the sun, and they all began to fight vehemently against one another for over an hour. But the spectacle did not end there. After this prolonged display, a large black spear-shaped object appeared in the sky. According to Glaser's account, all of the objects then fell from the sky toward the earth, as if they had burned themselves out, and they faded away on the ground with immense smoke. The residents of Nuremberg were terrified. Many interpreted the display as a warning from God, a sign of divine anger in a period when tensions surrounding the Protestant Reformation ran high across Europe. Glaser himself framed the event in religious terms, urging the citizens to repent. Now, modern skeptics have offered various explanations for what happened that morning. The citizens watched in frozen terror. Many dropped to their knees in the streets, convinced the end of days had arrived. Church bells rang out across the city as word of the spectacle spread from neighborhood to neighborhood. Mothers clutched their children. Merchants abandoned their stalls. Priests emerged from their churches to stare at the sky alongside everyone else. For over an hour, the aerial display continued, an unrelenting, bewildering performance that turned the dawn sky into a theater of the impossible. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the objects seemed to exhaust themselves. They plummeted earthward, and the broadsheet describes immense smoke rising from where they had fallen beyond the city walls. Some witnesses reported that a large, arrow-shaped or spear-like object remained visible in the sky, even after the others had fallen, a dark silhouette hanging ominously against the morning light before it too faded from view. Glazer completed his woodcut and published the broadsheet within weeks. The image he created remains one of the most striking visual documents from the early modern period. It depicts the sun at the center, flanked by crescent arcs, surrounded by dozens of spheres, cylinders, and crosses, all set against the skyline of Nuremberg with its church spires and rooftops. At the bottom of the image, a large black arrowhead shape dominates the scene, and objects can be seen falling toward the ground, trailing what appears to be smoke or fire. The level of detail suggests that Glazer either witnessed the event himself or spoke extensively with those who did. Interestingly, a remarkably similar event was reported just 5 years later, in 1566, over the city of Basel, Switzerland, where residents described seeing red and black spheres engaged in an apparent battle in the sky, further suggesting that whatever was happening in the skies of 16th century Europe was not confined to a single incident. As for modern interpretations, skeptics have offered various explanations for what happened that morning. Some believe the event was a particularly vivid atmospheric phenomenon known as a sundog, or parhelion, caused by the refraction of light through ice crystals in the upper atmosphere. Others have suggested it may have been an elaborate misinterpretation of natural phenomena filtered through the lens of 16th century religious anxiety. The renowned Swiss psychoanalyst Carl Jung included the Nuremberg broadsheet in his 1958 book on flying saucers, interpreting the imagery as symbolic rather than literal, a projection of the collective unconscious. But what remains undeniable is that Glazer did not create the broadsheet in isolation. He described the event as being witnessed by many men and women, and the fact that it was published as a news broadsheet, one of the earliest forms of mass media in Europe, suggests it was taken seriously at the time. Whatever truly appeared above Nuremberg that morning, it was something that the people of that city felt compelled to document and share. That broadsheet, now housed in the archives of the Zentralbibliothek in Zurich, Switzerland, remains one of the oldest and most discussed pieces of evidence in the history of unidentified aerial phenomena. If the Nuremberg event stands as a relic from an age before science could properly investigate such claims, then what happened over Washington, D.C. in the summer of 1952 stands as something entirely different. This was the era of radar, jet interceptors, and a military apparatus that took threats to the nation's capital very seriously. And yet, on 2 consecutive weekends in July of that year, something appeared in the skies above the most heavily defended city on the planet, and no one could explain what it was. It began just before midnight on Saturday, July 19th, 1952. Edward Nugent, an air traffic controller working at Washington National Airport, noticed 7 unusual blips on his radar screen. They were located about 15 miles south-southwest of the capital, in an area where no known aircraft were supposed to be flying. Nugent immediately called over his supervisor, Harry Barnes, a senior air traffic controller who had spent years staring at radar screens and who knew the difference between equipment malfunctions and real targets. Barnes looked at the scope and knew almost instantly that something was very wrong. The objects were not following any known flight paths, and they moved at speeds and in patterns that no conventional aircraft of the era could achieve. Within minutes, other radar operators at National Airport confirmed the same targets. Then, as the objects drifted across the screen, Barnes watched in disbelief as the blips moved directly over the White House and the United States Capitol building. He immediately called Andrews Air Force Base, located about 10 miles from the airport. Andrews initially reported nothing on their radar, but almost as soon as the call ended, an airman at Andrews contacted the base's control tower to report a visual sighting. Airman William Brady, who was stationed in the tower, spotted what he described as an object that appeared to be like an orange ball of fire, trailing a tail, unlike anything he had ever seen before. As Brady tried to alert others, the object accelerated at what he called an unbelievable speed and vanished. Meanwhile, on one of National Airport's runways, a Capital Airlines pilot named S.C. Pierman was sitting in the cockpit of his DC-4, waiting for clearance to take off. After spotting what he initially believed to be a meteor, he was told by the control tower that their radar was tracking unknown objects closing in on his position. Over the next 14 minutes, Pierman observed 6 objects that he described as white, tailless, fast-moving lights. He was in radio contact with Barnes the entire time, and Barnes later confirmed that each of Pierman's visual sightings matched a radar return near his aircraft's position on the scope. At approximately 3 in the morning, the Air Force scrambled 2 F-94 Starfire jet fighters from Newcastle Air Force Base in Delaware. But as the jets approached Washington's airspace, all of the radar returns mysteriously vanished. The jets circled the area, found nothing, and eventually returned to base. And then, almost mockingly, the objects reappeared on radar the moment the jets left. This behavior convinced Barnes that the objects were actively monitoring radio traffic and adjusting their behavior accordingly. The objects were last picked up on radar at around 5:30 in the morning, just before sunrise. The following Monday, newspapers across the country ran front-page headlines about the incident. The Cedar Rapids Gazette in Iowa printed the words, "Saucers swarm over Capitol," in bold, black type. The story dominated the news cycle, and by sheer coincidence, Captain Edward Ruppelt, the man in charge of the Air Force's Project Blue Book investigation into UFO phenomena, happened to be in Washington at the time. But frustratingly, he did not learn about the sightings until he picked up a newspaper 2 days later. When he tried to investigate, he was denied even basic transportation around the city, as only generals and senior colonels were authorized to use government staff cars. Then, the very next Saturday night, July 26th, the objects returned. Radar operators at National Airport, Andrews Air Force Base, and other facilities all tracked multiple unidentified targets simultaneously. This time, the Air Force scrambled F-94 interceptors from both Newcastle and Andrews. Lieutenant William Patterson, one of the pilots, gave chase and reported that the objects surrounded his jet. He radioed Andrews to ask if he should open fire. According to Albert Chopp, a civilian press spokesperson who was present, the response was stunned silence. Patterson could not close on the objects. They outran him effortlessly. By 3 in the morning, the sightings ended again, fading with the coming dawn, just as they had the weekend before. The Air Force quickly convened what Major General John Samford, the Director of Air Intelligence, called the largest press conference since the end of World War II. The official explanation was temperature inversions, a meteorological condition where warm air traps cool air beneath it and can cause radar signals to bend and produce false returns. But the radar operators who had tracked the objects were experienced professionals who dealt with temperature inversions regularly. Harry Barnes himself stated that the inversions that night were not nearly strong enough to explain the solid, consistent returns they had been watching. Navy radar specialist Lieutenant Commander Gil Hayward, who was also present at National Airport that night, agreed that the radar targets behaved like solid, metallic objects. The Washington sightings even reached the desk of President Harry Truman, who personally called for answers. According to CIA historian Gerald Haynes, the massive buildup of sightings over the United States in 1952, especially in July, alarmed the Truman administration deeply. Truman's aide reportedly called the Air Force to ask what was happening, and Ruppelt, who still had not been allowed to properly investigate, suggested over the phone that the sightings might be caused by temperature inversions, though he admitted he had not yet interviewed a single witness. The president's concern was palpable. At one point during the frenzy, intelligence channels into and out of Washington were so jammed with UFO-related traffic that military planners grew worried that a real enemy could have used the chaos as cover for an actual attack on the Capitol. The press conference that followed on July 29, 1952, was called by many the largest press conference since the end of World War II. Major General John Samford stood before a room packed with reporters and calmly attributed the sightings to temperature inversions. His tone was measured, his demeanor reassuring, and his explanation just scientific enough to satisfy the newspapers. But behind closed doors, the intelligence community was far from satisfied. The CIA had been paying close attention to the wave of sightings all summer, and the Washington incidents pushed them into action. The agency formed a special study group within its Office of Scientific Intelligence and Office of Current Intelligence to review the situation. This would eventually lead to the creation of the Robertson Panel in early 1953. A group of scientists convened under CIA auspices who concluded that the public's fascination with UFOs could be exploited by hostile powers, and recommended a policy of debunking and public education to reduce the number of reports. Some historians view this as the beginning of a decades-long campaign to suppress public interest in the phenomenon. To this day, the events of those 2 weekends in July 1952 remain classified as unknowns in the official Project Blue Book files. Project Blue Book investigated 12,618 UFO sightings from 1947 until it was terminated in 1969. Of those, 701 remain unidentified, and the Washington, D.C. sightings are among the most prominent. 30 years later, another wave of sightings would grip the American imagination, this time unfolding not over a single weekend, but across several years in the rolling hills and quiet suburban towns of New York's Hudson River Valley. Between 1982 and 1986, thousands of residents across Westchester County, Dutchess County, Putnam County, and into parts of Connecticut reported seeing an enormous, slow-moving, silent object in the night sky, adorned with brilliant colored lights arranged in a V or boomerang shape. The first recorded sighting occurred just before midnight on New Year's Eve 1982, when a retired police officer in Kent Cliffs, New York, and his family observed a boomerang-shaped formation of lights drift silently over their home. It was a strange way to ring in the new year, and the officer, despite decades of professional experience evaluating unusual situations, could not identify what he had seen. But he was far from the last to see it. Over the following months, reports poured in from across the region. Witnesses described the object as being absolutely enormous, some saying it appeared to be the size of a football field or larger. It moved so slowly that people could walk beneath it, and many described being able to make out a dark, metallic structure linking the lights together. On the evening of March 24, 1983, a tidal wave of sightings occurred. more than 300 people called in reports that single night, all describing the same V-shaped object with multicolored lights. Police switchboards in Yorktown, New York, were completely jammed with calls. Officers in Newcastle reported receiving a flood of similar reports from panicked and bewildered residents. Among the witnesses that night was Dennis Sant, the county clerk, who along with his father got close enough to the object to observe its dark gray metallic surface and hear a finely tuned engine sound. He estimated the object was just under 40 meters long and more than 100 meters wide, with red, green, and white lights along its sides. The sightings drew the attention of Dr. J. Allen Hynek, a renowned astronomer who had served as the scientific consultant to the Air Force's Project Blue Book for 20 years. Hynek, along with researcher Philip Imbrogno and journalist Bob Pratt, investigated the Hudson Valley sightings and ultimately documented their findings in the book Night Siege. Their research team estimated that more than 5,000 people reported seeing the object during the peak years of the wave between 1982 and 1986. By the time they stopped investigating, the number had grown to over 7,000 reports spanning more than a decade. Not everyone was convinced the sightings represented something genuinely unexplained. State police eventually identified a group of private pilots who admitted to flying small Cessna 152 aircraft in tight formation at night, using modified bright lights on their undersides to create the illusion of a single large object. When they switched off their lights simultaneously, the object appeared to vanish. This explanation satisfied some investigators, but many witnesses vehemently disagreed. They pointed out that what they had seen moved silently, hovered motionless for extended periods, and performed instantaneous right-angle turns, none of which are capabilities of small propeller-driven aircraft flying in formation. Some witnesses even reported seeing the object on one night, and then recognizing the formation of small planes on a different night, insisting the two were completely different phenomena. In July 1984, a particularly dramatic sighting occurred when the object was videotaped over Brewster, New York, and then appeared just 15 minutes later, hovering above the Indian Point nuclear power plant on the Hudson River. 12 security officers at the facility watched the object linger above the river for several minutes before it shot straight upward and disappeared. The incident raised serious security concerns, but the FAA officially denied anything unusual had occurred in the skies over the Hudson Valley, even though some air traffic controllers privately admitted to tracking unknown objects on their radar. Across the Atlantic, just a few years after the Hudson Valley wave began to taper off, another country found itself at the center of a UFO mystery that would become one of the most credible and well-documented cases in modern history. Beginning in late November 1989 and continuing through April 1990, the nation of Belgium experienced a wave of sightings involving large, silent, triangular craft that were observed by thousands of citizens, tracked by military radar, and pursued by the Belgian Air Force. The wave began on the evening of November 29, 1989, near the small town of Eupen, close to the German border. Two police officers, Heinrich Nicole and Hubert von Montigny, were conducting a routine patrol when they noticed something hovering in the sky above a nearby field. The object was enormous, dark, and triangular, with 3 intensely bright white lights at each corner and a flashing red or orange light at its center. The lights were so powerful that one of the officers later compared them to the floodlights on a football pitch. The object moved slowly and made no sound whatsoever. The officers radioed their dispatcher, Albert Kreutz, who also confirmed the sighting. Over the course of that first night alone, 30 groups of witnesses and at least 13 police officers reported seeing the same triangular craft as it moved silently across the Belgian countryside. In the weeks and months that followed, reports multiplied across the French-speaking region of Wallonia. Local newspapers published witness sketches and testimonies, all remarkably consistent in their descriptions. The objects were dark, flat, triangular, enormous in size, and moved at impossibly low speeds before suddenly accelerating to extraordinary velocities. Some witnesses described the craft hovering motionless above their homes for minutes at a time before gliding away without a sound. Among the witnesses were not just everyday civilians, but trained military personnel, police officers, scientists, engineers, and airline pilots. The Belgian military took the sighting seriously from the outset. Colonel Wilfred de Brouwer, who was then the Chief of Operations of the Royal Belgian Air Force, established a special task force to work with the National Police to investigate reports as they came in. The climax of the Belgian wave arrived on the night of March 30th to 31, 1990. That evening, multiple ground-based radar stations detected unidentified objects performing movements that no known aircraft could replicate. Dozens of witnesses on the ground simultaneously reported seeing a triangular craft with bright white lights. In response, the Belgian Air Force scrambled 2 F-16 fighter jets from Beauvechane Air Base. For nearly an hour, the 2 pilots attempted 9 separate interceptions of the target. On 3 occasions, they achieved a radar lock on the object. But each time they did, the object responded with evasive maneuvers that left the pilots stunned. According to radar data, the craft accelerated from approximately 280 kilometers per hour to over 1,800 kilometers per hour in a matter of seconds, all without producing a sonic boom. It also changed altitude by thousands of feet almost instantaneously. The pilots never managed to get a visual confirmation of the object, despite their instruments telling them something was clearly there. An estimated 13,500 people reported witnessing the events of that single night, making it one of the most widely observed UFO incidents in modern history. The Belgian government's response to the wave was unprecedented. Unlike most nations, which typically deny or dismiss UFO reports, the Belgian Air Force cooperated fully with civilian researchers from the Society for the Study of Space Phenomena, known by its French acronym SOBEPS. Radar data, pilot debriefings, and military reports were shared with the public in a rare display of transparency. Over the course of the wave, more than 2,600 written witness statements were collected, and more than 2,000 individual sightings were documented. More than 300 of these sightings were from witnesses who observed the craft from a distance of less than 300 meters, close enough to make out structural details. Over 200 of the sightings lasted longer than 5 minutes, giving witnesses ample time to observe and process what they were seeing. General de Brouwer himself publicly acknowledged that the sightings represented a real phenomenon, though he could not identify what it was. He later stated that what impressed him most were the witnesses themselves, many of whom he knew personally and found entirely credible. He expressed dismay at the stigma around UFOs that prevented many people from coming forward, noting that some witnesses who made reports in 1989 were still being hounded and discredited years later. He personally knew a journalist and a NATO employee who had experienced remarkable sightings, but refused to put their accounts on paper for fear of professional repercussions. In 2007, de Brouwer spoke about the Belgian wave at an international press conference at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. organized by investigative journalist Leslie Kean, calling for a more objective and better coordinated investigation of the UFO phenomenon worldwide. One of the most widely circulated pieces of evidence from the Belgian wave was a photograph taken in April 1990 in the town of Petit-Rachin, purportedly showing a triangular craft with 3 bright lights at its corners against a dark sky. The image was analyzed by scientists at NASA, the French National Center for Scientific Research, and the Belgian Royal Military Academy, none of whom could conclusively identify it as a fake. However, in 2011, a man named Patrick Maréchal came forward and admitted that the photograph was a hoax he had constructed using a piece of styrofoam cut into a triangle, painted black, with flashlights embedded in each corner and hung from a string. The confession tarnished one piece of evidence, but it did nothing to explain the thousands of witness accounts, the radar data, or the Air Force's own inability to identify what its pilots had been chasing. That very same autumn of 1989, on the other side of the Iron Curtain, something equally strange allegedly descended upon a public park in the Russian city of Voronezh, located roughly 300 miles southeast of Moscow. This was not a distant sighting of lights in the sky. If the witnesses are to be believed, this was a landing, and the visitors got out. According to the Soviet state news agency, TASS, which broke the story to the world on October 9, 1989, the incident had occurred on the evening of September 27th at approximately 6:30 in the evening. A group of children were playing football in a park area known as Yuzhny Park, or South Park, in the Levoberezhny district of Voronezh. As the children kicked the ball around, they noticed a pinkish glow in the sky above them. Within moments, a large, deep red spherical object, estimated to be about 15 meters wide and 6 meters tall, descended slowly and hovered above the park. The sphere circled once, vanished, then reappeared minutes later and settled near the ground. What happened next is where the account becomes almost impossibly bizarre. According to the children, a hatch opened on the object, and 3 entities emerged. The beings were described as approximately 9 feet tall, with disproportionately small heads, 3 eyes, and bronze-colored skin. They were clad in what witnesses described as silvery, metallic suits. Accompanying the beings was a smaller figure that appeared to be robotic in nature. TASS reported that one of the beings surveyed the crowd of terrified onlookers, and when a boy in the crowd screamed, the creature fixed its gaze on him. The boy reportedly fell silent and was unable to move, as though paralyzed. The beings then re-entered the sphere, which lifted off and vanished. But according to the account, the craft returned a short time later, and one of the entities pointed a tube-like device at a 16-year-old boy, causing him to disappear entirely in front of dozens of witnesses. When the sphere departed for the final time, the teenager reappeared, seemingly unharmed. Now, the Voronezh incident is one of the most controversial cases in UFO history, and for good reason. The primary witnesses were children, and the claims were extraordinary even by the standards of the field. But there are elements that make the case difficult to dismiss outright. TASS was the official state news agency of the Soviet Union, not a tabloid. Publishing such a story carried institutional weight, and the Communist Party newspaper Sovietskaya Kultura also covered the event, defending the decision by citing the golden rule of journalism. The reader must know everything. Investigators from the Voronezh Geophysical Laboratory visited the site and claimed to find depressions in the ground consistent with something extremely heavy having landed there, as well as anomalies in the local magnetic field and elevated radiation levels. The children, when kept in isolation from one another, produced drawings of the beings and craft that were remarkably consistent. A local police lieutenant, Sergei Matveyev, independently confirmed seeing a body flying in the sky on the same evening. Several other Voronezh residents also claimed to have observed the craft on multiple dates between September 21st and October 2nd of that year. Skeptics, however, point out that French press agency reporters who traveled to Voronezh could find no verifiable proof of the landing. 16 radiometric analyses and 19 ground checks reportedly failed to uncover any conclusive anomaly. Vladimir Posner, a well-known Soviet journalist, sent a film crew to the city but could find no witnesses other than the original children, leading him to suggest that childish imagination may have been the driving force behind the story. Whether one believes the Voronezh incident represents genuine contact or a case of youthful invention amplified by a newly liberalized Soviet media hungry for extraordinary stories, it remains one of the most talked about UFO cases in Russian history. 5 years after the strange events in Voronezh, and half a world away on the African continent, another group of children would find themselves at the center of a UFO encounter that many researchers still call one of the most compelling close encounters of the 20th century. This time, it happened in broad daylight, in front of dozens of young witnesses, at a private school in the rural outskirts of Harare, Zimbabwe. The Ariel School was a relatively small private elementary school located near the town of Ruwa, about 14 miles southeast of Zimbabwe's capital. It served a diverse group of students from various ethnic and cultural backgrounds, though all came from relatively affluent families, given the school's tuition costs. On the morning of September 16, 1994, the school's adult faculty were gathered inside for a staff meeting, leaving the roughly 250 students unsupervised during their mid-morning break. It was at approximately 10 o'clock that morning when some of the children playing outside noticed something strange in the sky. According to the accounts that would soon flood in, one or more silver, disc-shaped objects appeared above the trees and descended into a field of scrubby brush and small trees just beyond the school's boundary. Of the 250 children at the school that day, 62 of them, ranging in age from 6 to 12, later stated that they had seen the objects. Not all of them described the same thing in precisely the same way, which is actually what one might expect from a group of children of varying ages processing an unfamiliar experience in real time. But the core of the accounts was strikingly consistent. They described silver or gray disc-shaped craft, and some of the children said they saw one or more beings emerge from or stand near the objects. The beings were described as having large, dark eyes and wearing tight-fitting black clothing. When the children returned to their classrooms after the break, they poured out their stories to their teachers, but were initially dismissed. It was only when the children went home that evening and told their parents, who then called the school, that the faculty began to take the report seriously. The headmaster asked the children to draw what they had seen, and the resulting pictures showed a remarkable consistency, depicting saucer-like craft and figures with oversized eyes. Local UFO researcher Cynthia Hind was one of the first investigators on the scene. She visited the school on September 20th, just 4 days after the event, and conducted interviews with the children. She found their testimonies to be sincere and consistent. The BBC's correspondent in Zimbabwe at the time, veteran war reporter Tim Leach, also visited the school and filmed interviews with the students. Leach, a man who had covered armed conflicts across Africa, was visibly shaken by what the children told him. He later remarked that he could handle war zones, but he could not handle this. The children's testimonies were so compelling that they attracted the attention of Dr. John Mack, a Pulitzer Prize-winning author and professor of psychiatry at Harvard University, who traveled to Zimbabwe in November 1994 to interview the witnesses firsthand. Mack spent time with the children, speaking with them individually and in small groups. Through his interviews, a new and even more unsettling dimension of the encounter emerged. Some of the children reported that the beings had communicated with them, not through speech, but through what they described as a kind of telepathic transmission. The children said they received a message with an environmental theme, a warning that human beings were damaging the earth, and that the consequences would be severe if the destruction continued. Many of the children were deeply frightened, and some were reduced to tears as they recounted the experience. The aerial school encounter has been the subject of debate ever since. Critics point to the suggestive nature of the interview techniques employed, particularly by Mack, whose previous work on alien abduction phenomena made him a controversial figure even among his colleagues at Harvard. Some have called the incident a case of mass hysteria, arguing that one or two children may have sparked an imaginative chain reaction among the others. In a 2023 Netflix documentary, one former student named Dallin even claimed that he had started the entire incident as a prank, telling classmates that a shiny rock in the distance was a UFO. However, this claim directly contradicts statements Dallin himself made on camera 15 years earlier, in which he described the UFO as having a light that would flash a different color in the sky. What is perhaps most remarkable is that many of the witnesses, now adults well into their 30s and 40s, continue to maintain that what they experienced that day was real. They have stuck to their stories through decades of scrutiny, ridicule, and public pressure, and many still speak about the encounter with an emotional intensity that is difficult to fake. The aerial school encounter draws inevitable comparisons to another school-based mass sighting that occurred nearly 3 decades earlier, on the opposite side of the African continent, and even further south, in the suburbs of Melbourne, Australia. On the morning of April 6, 1966, a Wednesday just before the Easter holidays, students and staff at Westall High School in the suburb of Clayton South experienced what many researchers have called the most significant mass UFO sighting in Australian history. It was approximately 11 o'clock in the morning, and the students were outside during their physical education period. The sky was clear and bright, a fine autumn day in the southern hemisphere. Without warning, a silvery gray, disc-shaped object appeared above the school grounds. Witnesses described it as round with a domed top, metallic in appearance, and roughly twice the size of a family car. The object moved erratically, hovering above the school's playing fields before descending behind a row of century-old pine trees and into an area known as the Grange, an open expanse of bushland and overgrown fields just south of the school. Students poured out of classrooms and streamed toward the field to get a closer look. Teachers followed, some trying to maintain order, others abandoning their authority entirely and simply staring at the sky alongside their students. Andrew Greenwood, a science teacher at the school and a self-described UFO skeptic, was one of the faculty who observed the object. He later described it as silver gray, noting that it seemed to thicken at times, similar to how a disc might appear when turned slightly to reveal its underside. He also reported that the object exhibited the most amazing flying he had ever seen, moving with a kind of controlled, deliberate intelligence that no conventional aircraft could replicate. As the object descended toward the Grange, approximately 5 light aircraft, possibly Cessnas, appeared to give chase. Witnesses recalled the planes circling, banking sharply, and making erratic maneuvers as though trying to intercept or keep pace with the UFO. Every time the planes got too close, Greenwood noted, the object would slowly accelerate, then rapidly accelerate, then move away from them and stop. Then the planes would take off after it again, and the same thing would happen. Colin Kelly, a former student, went even further, claiming he saw not one but 3 objects in the sky, a large one flanked by 2 smaller craft. He said they elevated while on their sides and disappeared at an ungodly speed. Several students ran to the Grange and found what they described as a circular impression in the long grass, roughly 8 meters in diameter, where the vegetation had been flattened and appeared scorched or boiled. The school's headmaster, Frank Samblaby, was reportedly inundated with phone calls from journalists, the Australian Air Force, and concerned parents throughout the day. According to multiple witnesses, in the days following the incident, men in dark suits arrived at the school and instructed both students and faculty not to speak about what they had seen. The students were told that discussing the event could hurt their future careers. Many complied, burying the memory for decades. The local Dandenong Journal ran the incident as its front-page story under the headline, "Flying Saucer Mystery, School Silent," noting that students and staff had been instructed to talk to no one about what had happened. The newspaper also reported that photographs had been taken of the landing circle, but these images were never published and have never surfaced. The Australian newspaper, The Age, initially suggested the object was a weather balloon, but witnesses who had seen the object at close range found this explanation laughable. In 2006, on the 40th anniversary of the sighting, a reunion of witnesses was organized. About 50 former students and teachers returned to the school and the Grange to retrace their steps from that day. Many of them shared their experiences publicly for the first time, and their accounts were remarkably consistent despite the passage of 4 decades. The 2010 documentary Westall 66, a suburban UFO mystery, directed by Rosie Jones, featured extensive interviews with former witnesses, many of whom were visibly emotional as they recounted the event. Researcher Shane Ryan, a lecturer at the University of Canberra, spent years interviewing over 100 witnesses and found their testimonies to be among the most compelling he had ever encountered. In 2013, the Kingston City Council erected a UFO-themed playground at the Grange Reserve, complete with a silver flying saucer and information boards about the events of April 6, 1966. A permanent government-sanctioned acknowledgement that something happened over Westall High School that morning that has never been adequately explained. Skeptics have pointed to a theory involving the Hybel program, a classified project that used high-altitude balloons to monitor atmospheric radiation levels following British nuclear tests at Maralinga in the Australian outback. Researcher Keith Basterfield located documents suggesting that a test balloon launched from Mildura may have been blown off course and come down near Westall High School. The silver parachute-equipped balloons would have appeared unusual and unfamiliar to the students. However, this explanation does not account for the reported 5 aircraft giving chase, the circular depression in the grass, or the extraordinary maneuvering described by trained observer Andrew Greenwood. Whatever happened at Westall in 1966, it affected its witnesses deeply, and many have carried the memory and the frustration of not being believed for their entire lives. On the evening of March 13, 1997, the American Southwest became the stage for what many researchers have called the most widely witnessed UFO event in modern history. On that clear, moonless night, thousands of people across the states of Nevada and Arizona, and reportedly into parts of northern Mexico, looked up and saw something that would become known simply as the Phoenix Lights. The first report came in at approximately 6:55 in the evening from a man in Henderson, Nevada, who described seeing a V-shaped formation of lights moving southeast across the sky. At around 8:15, a former police officer in Paulden, Arizona, about 200 miles to the north of Phoenix, spotted a cluster of reddish-orange lights and followed them through his binoculars until they faded over the southern horizon. Minutes later, additional calls flooded in from Prescott, Arizona, where witnesses reported a group of white and reddish orbs. It was now becoming clear that there were two distinct phenomena in the sky that night, one involving a V-shaped formation of lights that appeared to be part of a single massive structure, and the other a series of stationary or slowly falling orbs. As the V-shaped formation drifted south toward Phoenix, witnesses along its path stared up in a mixture of awe and terror. Many described the object as being absolutely enormous, with some estimates placing it at a mile or more in width. It moved so slowly and so silently that it almost seemed to hover, blotting out the stars as it passed overhead. 31-year-old Dana Valentine was standing in his backyard in Phoenix when he noticed the lights. He called his father, an aeronautical engineer, outside to watch. Together, they observed what appeared to be a massive V-shaped craft passing directly above them at roughly 500 feet. Valentine later stated that they could see the outline of a mass behind the lights, but could not see the mass itself, describing it as a gray distortion of the night sky. He said he had never seen anything like it, and was certain it represented technology that the public had never heard of. 54-year-old Tim Lay was driving through North Phoenix with his family when the lights appeared. He got out of his car and stood in the street, watching the formation slowly drift south. He described the experience as astonishing and more than a little frightening. Meanwhile, actor Kurt Russell was flying his private plane into Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport when he spotted the V formation and reported it to air traffic control. He later confirmed the sighting in a 2017 interview and wondered aloud whether he might have been the first person to officially report the lights. The second phase of the sightings occurred later that evening, around 10 o'clock, when a row of brilliant reddish-orange lights appeared in the sky to the southwest of Phoenix, hovering in an arc above the Sierra Estrella mountain range. These lights blinked on one by one, remained stationary for several moments, and then winked out in sequence. This second set of lights was captured on multiple photographs and video recordings, making it one of the most documented UFO events in history. Dr. Lynn Kittay, a Phoenix physician, was among the witnesses. She was so profoundly affected by what she saw that she eventually left her medical career to devote herself full-time to researching the Phoenix Lights, estimating that between 10,000 and 20,000 people may have witnessed the events that night. The official response was, to many witnesses, deeply unsatisfying. Then Arizona Governor Fife Symington held a press conference shortly after the sightings in which he brought out his chief of staff dressed in an alien costume, mocking the public's concern. Years later, however, Symington changed his tune dramatically. In 2007, he publicly admitted that he had personally witnessed the V-shaped formation on the night of March 13, 1997, and described what he saw as otherworldly. He said his reluctance to come forward at the time had been influenced by the fact that he was under federal indictment and could not afford to add fuel to what was already a media firestorm. The military's explanation centered on two events. The first V-shaped formation was attributed to a group of A-10 Thunderbolt aircraft flying in formation out of Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson, part of an Air National Guard training program called Operation Snowbird. The second set of lights, the hovering orbs above the Sierra Estrella, were identified as illumination flares dropped by A-10 aircraft conducting exercises at the Barry Goldwater Range in southwest Arizona. A young amateur astronomer in Scottsdale named Mitch Stanley even claimed that he had viewed the V formation through a powerful telescope and identified them as individual aircraft. But many witnesses remained unconvinced. The object they saw, they insisted, was a single, solid, silent craft of extraordinary size, not a collection of separate aircraft. The debate has raged ever since, and a 1997 Rocky Mountain poll indicated that up to 10% of Arizona residents believed they had witnessed something that night, making it one of the most shared experiences in the state's modern history. A decade after the skies above Arizona put the world on notice, another mass sighting would rock the quiet town of Stephenville, Texas, on the evening of January 8, 2008. Stephenville was a small community of about 17,000 people, known primarily for its dairy farms and its proximity to the open rangeland of Erath County. It was the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbors and where the biggest news typically involved cattle prices or high school football scores. That all changed in a single evening. Steve Allen, a 50-year-old trucking company owner and licensed pilot, was sitting around a campfire with friends at a home outside the nearby community of Selden when he noticed something unusual in the sky to the east. Brilliant white lights, brighter than anything he had ever seen, were moving toward them at high speed. The lights were arranged in a formation that seemed to reconfigure as they moved, first appearing as individual orbs, then forming an arc, and then rearranging into two vertical columns before bursting into a dirty white flame and vanishing. Allen, who had decades of flying experience, estimated that the object was roughly a mile long and half a mile wide. He stated flatly that it was positively, absolutely nothing from these parts. About 10 minutes after the initial sighting, Allen and his companions saw the lights reappear in the opposite direction. This time, they were trailed by what appeared to be military jets and large red orbs. Meanwhile, Erath County Constable Leroy Gaitan stepped outside his home and saw the same red orbs. Gaitan, who was up for re-election and worried about the political implications of reporting a UFO, waited until others had spoken publicly before confirming what he had witnessed. Within days, the story had exploded. The Mutual UFO Network, commonly known as MUFON, organized a town hall meeting in Stephenville and expected a handful of curious locals. Instead, hundreds of people showed up, many of them describing sightings that matched Allen's account. Some of the witnesses were police officers, pilots, and former military personnel. Television crews arrived from across the globe, from CNN and the BBC to networks in Japan and Brazil. The Stephenville Empire Tribune, the local newspaper, ran the story on its front page, and reporter Angelia Joyner became a key figure in chronicling the events. The initial military response was denial. Officials at the Naval Air Station Joint Reserve Base in Fort Worth, located about an hour from Stephenville, stated that no military aircraft were in the area on the night of January 8th. But within 2 weeks, the Air Force reversed its position and admitted that 10 F-16 fighter jets from the 457th Fighter Squadron had been conducting night training exercises in the Stephenville area on that very evening. They blamed the initial denial on an internal communications error, stating that in the interest of public awareness, Air Force Reserve Command Public Affairs realized an error was made regarding the reported training activity of military aircraft. The reversal only deepened public suspicion, and for many residents, it felt like a cover-up unraveling in real time. Local reporter Angelia Joyner at the Stephenville Empire Tribune became a central figure in the story, doggedly pursuing interviews and following up on leads. Her reporting gave voice to witnesses who might otherwise have remained silent, and she faced significant professional pressure as a result. Some witnesses also alleged that government representatives had attempted to intimidate them into keeping quiet about what they had seen. Rancher Ricky Sorrells, who lived near Dublin and claimed to have seen a flat metallic object hovering about 300 feet above a pasture behind his home, reported being visited by military personnel who encouraged him not to discuss the sighting publicly. 6 months after the sightings, MUFON released a 77-page report authored by radar engineer Glenn Schulze and nanotechnology researcher Robert Powell. The report was based on Federal Aviation Administration radar data obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests from 5 different radar installations in the region. Powell and Schulze first identified the radar tracks of the 10 F-16S, which had active transponders. They then searched for objects that did not have transponder codes and found them. The radar data showed an unknown object that was tracked for more than an hour. At times it remained stationary or moved at relatively slow speeds, and then it would rapidly accelerate to extreme velocities, far beyond the capabilities of any known conventional aircraft. The report concluded that the radar data corroborated what Steve Allen, Leroy Gayton, and dozens of other witnesses had described. Perhaps most unsettling of all, the radar tracks showed the unknown object heading in the general direction of the Crawford Ranch, the so-called Western White House, where President George W. Bush retreated during his time in office. This detail was never officially addressed. As with so many of the cases we have explored tonight, the Stephenville sightings ultimately produced more questions than answers. The Air Force's changing story, the independent radar confirmation, and the sheer number of credible witnesses made it one of the most significant UFO events of the 21st century. Former Air Force navigation specialist James Hughes, a Stephenville resident who witnessed the lights on January 8th, told Popular Mechanics that he did not call them flying saucers or extraterrestrials. All he said was that they were unidentified flying objects, and he was sticking to that assessment. He could not identify them, and neither, it seemed, could anyone else. The sightings even continued into the fall of 2008, with new reports emerging from the Stephenville area, though by then much of the national media had moved on. What makes the Stephenville case particularly significant in the broader history of UFO phenomena is the way it bridged the gap between the pre-digital and digital eras of investigation. Radar data was obtained through official channels. Witness testimony was cross-referenced against military flight records. Journalists investigated alongside independent researchers, and still, no definitive answer emerged. The case was featured in a full episode of UFO Hunters, which called it one of the biggest sightings of the decade, and it was later revisited in the first episode of the Netflix documentary series Encounters in 2023, where witnesses including Steve Allen and Leroy Gayton shared their accounts with a new generation of viewers. What connects all of these cases, spanning centuries and continents, from the cobblestone streets of Renaissance Nuremberg to the open ranches of modern Texas, is the sheer volume of human beings who saw something they could not explain. These were not isolated individuals making outlandish claims in the dark. They were police officers, military personnel, airline pilots, school children, governors, and ordinary citizens who looked up at the same time and saw the same impossible thing. Whether the explanations lie in atmospheric phenomena, classified military technology, or something far stranger, the fact remains that these events happened, and the people who experienced them have never forgotten. In almost every case, governments either denied what happened, offered explanations that the witnesses themselves rejected, or simply went silent. And in almost every case, the witnesses kept talking because whatever they saw in the sky that day or night was too profound, too vivid, and too real to simply forget. If you enjoyed tonight's journey through some of history's most extraordinary mass sightings, consider leaving a like. And if you have not already, hit that subscribe button so you never miss another episode. Until next time, sleep well, and maybe think twice the next time you look up at the night sky.